inform, not to make conclusions. That's why we're making proposals, because we want a broader discussion that looks beyond the recent aspects of people thinking this level of FRIS, it's VAT, it is so many things. Ultimately, we want to see how do we get the policies right that will grow the economy with jobs, that will increase taxes in a fair way and in a sustainable way. How do we ensure manufacturers continue to operate? The report we saw yesterday indicates that the bulk of the manufacturing units, small scale and large scale, are operating, some of them between 30%, 34% capacity. How do you bring that up? Because for such an investor, it's really a question of not having a transmission line or land established. It's actually a question of the market. This person has already invested but is using only 30 to 34% of their capacity. How do we bring back that person's hopes and reinvestment on the good rate of return on his investment? You get back to the demand function. You want to look at what is the nature of the demand. The research we've been looking at based on the information from the Bureau of Statistics, we are seeing that final consumption expenditure, which actually informs the demand in the market, is household incomes. That household expenditure is 70% of GDP. Government is only just about 7%. So how do we empower the households to continue consuming? Because if they can't afford consuming certain expensive items, then imports will continue to come into the country. And we've seen that trend continue, that Ugandan manufacturers are not competitive, which speaks to the president's concern that if we continue buying from abroad, then we are creating jobs out there. We're having hemorrhage. But it's not going to be a question of legalities and politics and talking. It's going to be a question of strategy. How do you make this local Ugandan manufacturer produce to meet what their consumers can afford? And if their costs they can't go below, how do we make sure the households can afford? Effectively designing government programs that are going to increase the household incomes. We have seen from information provided by the Uganda Revenue Authority, I was reading the newsletter for June 2023, that is last year, that companies between the range of 30 billion to 100 billion were literally in 2018-19, there were about 1,155 companies that were that big, 30 billion to 100 billion. In 2019-2020, they declined to 1,126. Now, COVID hit. 2020 to 2021, they became only 21 companies. From 1,000 down to 21. 21-22, those companies had rebounded back but to only 46. Now, the latest information, 2 years post-COVID, that is if there is such a word as post-COVID, because we know it's still within the market, we have seen continued decline in company sizes. And again, from the information that companies between 5 billion to 10 billion, they declined by 92% between 2019, 2020 to 2022, 2023. Those ones above 100 billion have also declined by 95%. Now that goes with taxes. That goes with jobs. That goes sometimes some of these companies, because they have bank loans that cannot come down, they literally have to collapse. They have to close. How do we revive an economy and make it grow? These are facts that we cannot ignore. And we need to get back to what are the key drivers of some of these constraints. I was working through numbers. If a company borrows just about 2 billion at 19%, that company is required to find about 73 million per month to service that loan, if the loan is for 3 years. Now, if we revise the central bank rate and banks mobilize capital at a higher rate and revise the 19% for this company to 23%, the company will now be required to find $77 million shillings per month. Now, if your sales have gone down, taxes have gone up, other utility costs have gone up, then this company is headed for disaster. And this begins to explain the shrinkage in these companies. So our final kind of discussion is on how do we grow the economy? How do we bring back these companies? Part of it, again, is speaking to tax policy. when you assess companies that have not been filing rightly, and you go back and ask them to meet the tax obligations of 5-10 years ago, when they are actually struggling to survive even in the current year, then you are going to find them out. Now, that's not a URA matter, it's a policy matter. But that's policy issue that should be informed on how do we intend to grow this economy. How do we intend to salvage the existing companies so that they can continue employing people and paying taxes going forward? It's a policy question that we want to put on the table because partly it's arising out of our monetary policy stance. We also have a case on fiscal policy, the government papers. The government papers are the most lucrative business in the market today. If somebody buys a bond of 20 years, 15 years, first of all, you are going to be taxed at 10% to incentivize you to buy that bond. But we are losing revenue. And because it's 15% return on investment, for you not even going into the encumbrances of investing, of running logistics and the rest of that, we are seeing more people get into that space. So the investment in the government papers is literally an investment by companies and individuals, including the banks, in areas that do not necessarily create jobs, in areas that do not increase goods and services. And since me and you continue to require goods and services, the traders have no option but to import. Because nobody is producing the items that we need. They are not investors in the area of manufacturing and production. They are traders. And since we need the items, but the real people who would have gone in manufacturing have gone into government bonds, then you are going to continue with your escalation of imports. And we have seen an increase in imports between 2018-19 and 2023, an increase in imports of 117%. That's quite a significant portion. Much as the president wants to reverse imports, we've got to say what are the key drivers of these imports. It's policy issues. The president, as the people say in the military, the commander's intent, has given his intention. Now we need to realign the policy to meet that objective or that desire that the president has put out there. Otherwise, if we continue with some of these, you are not only curtailing jobs and growth in terms of production, you are also creating a perpetual challenge to the government budget. And we have seen clearly government budgets coming through, where we are told that much as the budget is increasing, we still have a problem of the discretionary resource going down, which we'll need to have to address, because if the government budget increases but resources available for the Ministry of Finance to direct to the needs of the economy is shrinking, then you are going to have quite a big challenge. We've been looking through some of the numbers that we have already issued between July and March. I think government had issued about 1.2, or rather 1.2 trillion in government papers. Now of this, only less than 40% or thereabout is available for service delivery. The rest is going into the refinancing of the debt. Meaning we must go back and look at how do we deal with the 12 trillion refinancing that's going to be in the budget for 2024-25, which is triggering an interest payment of 8 trillion. We need to address that base and begin to constrain the 12 trillion, which is simply refinancing and driving interest, in order to release resources for growing this economy. Now, these are going to be significant discussions of a policy nature. I know Parliament has been trying to implement the rationalization strategy, but remember we have said rationalization was literally RAPEX, rationalization of agencies and public expenditure. What is going on now is the rationalization of agencies. The public expenditure goes beyond the agencies. So that next phase also needs to come into question on how do we rationalize and reduce the government without necessarily constraining effectiveness of delivery of services and the quality of services and the quantity of services. And then the people will be able to feel those services, and in response, the economy will be able to grow. So quite a numbers we've said beyond the conversations on raising revenues to how do we grow the economy, because ultimately revenues are a function of the structure, the size, and speed at which the economy is growing. And ultimately, that's the benefit for the welfare of Ugandans, getting those jobs, getting goods and services at affordable rates. So there are quite a number of conversations that we want to be brought into the picture and into the equation if we are to address the key economic concerns amidst fragility and other risks that are rising out of the global dimensions. We can't afford to miss out the point that also the President indicated in his latest remark, that we have wars in the region that are affecting our trade. The war in Sudan, we have a war in the DRC, eastern part of the DRC. We still haven't closed the issues in Somalia. We have the war in the Middle East. We have wars in Ukraine, which are really configuring global dynamics, the flow of resources, increasing the cost of credit at the global level, not just for government, but also for the private sector. So at this point when we need massive investments, how do we finance them, but also how do we strategically align them to ensure long-term sustainability of the economy? We can't keep in a short-term stabilization mode because we need to grow. And this is going to take a conversation on our exchange rates. Where should they be? Because they are a major parameter for competitiveness of a country. How do we invest in production upstream? Manufacturers, yesterday we were discussing with them. Many of them have a challenge with the upstream. Regina, who does for us hibiscus, various drinks and the rest of the things that come out of there, cannot grow the hibiscus herself. She has to buy it from the farmers. These farmers need support from extension service providers. They need all those kinds of categories. So how do you address the entire value chain for each of the specific items in order to make the Ugandan manufacturer competitive? Short of that, we are in an open market, and that's our policy. We are going to continue seeing imports which will undermine competitiveness, and we will fail to be able to realize the President's objective of growing a sustainable economy really that can compete in a global space. We are ready to take comments if there are any that have come through or any that are within the room. Otherwise, we want to once again thank you for being with us in this conversation and discussions that are going to continue. We want to make monthly conversations and discussions on matters that affect you out there in the economy in whichever area, whether it is health, whether it is infrastructure, roads, education. We want to keep informing the policy discussions and the policy messages and the interaction between the public sector and the private sector, the donor community, the civil society, because we are all in this together. Ultimately, it is for the welfare of the household. The statistics we are waiting for from the census will help us to know whether households have made progress. Otherwise, the current statistics of 2019-2020 put a number of households at earnings of 150,000 a month. Some of them 120,000 a month. Some of them are only at 90,000. A few are at 200, and only in the public sector do you begin to find households that are earning up to about 500,000. That's very low to give these households the thrust they need to survive, but also to be able to demand at a level that supports domestic industries. So, and as I've said, household consumption is 70% by expenditure of this GDP. If we do not address those households, there is no way we're going to grow this economy to levels that we want and to be able to get the resilience that will help us weather the storms that the world is going to throw at us. Some of them self-inflicted, but others we do not have anything to do. No matter what we do, we have to face them. So this conversation will continue, but first, for now, we want to have a few more minutes and address if there are any concerns that have come through online or those that may come through the house, or anybody in the house that may need to make a submission. This is your opportunity. We are sorry we couldn't invite very many people because of the constraint of the room, but we have been able to provide a link, and I can see quite a number of people have been out there. Let's begin in question. How do you strengthen the taxpayers? We want them to grow in number, we want them to grow in size, then it will become easier to collect the taxes. It also speaks to another conversation we shall have to continue with on how are we using our taxes, because that is what speaks back to compliance, that we can see what our taxes are doing, but it also speaks to reduced costs of doing business. We had a conversation yesterday, and everybody said the amount of money they are spending on spare parts because of the nature of the roads in Kampala. It is now rare to go along the highways and you don't find a truck that has broken down. Now, all that is supposed to be deductible if the system works well, because that's a cost of doing business. It is eating into the profit, so even if you are to charge corporation tax, you may find a company that was paying tax because it was making profits is no longer making profits. So you know it, you can see it, like all these companies have indicated that have shrunk. They can no longer pay corporation tax because many of them, I believe, are now in losses. And then others have laid off employees, so even the pay as you earn is lost out. And then you get into imports, and if the imports, as we said, are coming from Tanzania and Kenya, you again lose out on customs because of policy. So we are looking at a whole dimension of issues that are actually constraining revenue mobilization. And when you read the domestic resource revenue mobilization adopted in 2020, you don't find strength in that area of saying, besides finding the taxpayers and getting taxes out of them, what is our strategy to strengthen their growth and therefore their capability? As we say, you don't want to just milk the cow, you want to feed it in the morning, and in the evening or early morning the other day, you can get some milk back. So we want to see a strategy that goes there. The question on how do you bring smaller people to buy, or those with lower incomes to buy into the government bonds, I think that has actually been addressed. Now I think the minimum is about 100,000 you can invest and buy. But also I've seen other younger people get into unit trusts. They combine their little monies like a circle, like whatever it is, and then eventually raise the volume and go and buy the government bond. My question is the distortion that does. Because now if a government bond is 15% for 3 years, it means even the banks to mobilize money to go and lend, they must compete with what I would have put into the bank as a savings account. They must give me not less than 13%. Now, if a bank is going to mobilize credit at 13%, there is no way you are going to have a manufacturer and a trader borrow at less than 22%, adding on the cost of this bank, including the cost. Now, the bank, we used to only talk about operational costs, but now banks have also the cost of monetary policy, the cash reserve requirement. They are required to keep more than 10% of their deposits unlent. But remember, these are deposits they are paying interest on. They will pass it on to the few number of borrowers and raise their rate. But also they have, as we've said, companies are not working well. So even those which borrowed from the banks are unable to pay back their loans. So the losses, the non-performing assets, will be passed on as a cost to the bank, and maybe the banks may try to push that as a higher interest on the borrowers. We have been looking at the reports by the central bank, which show an increase in the demand for credit over the last quarter, but a decrease in how many people have been authorized to receive the money by the banks. And the banks are more concerned about non-performing assets, seeing the nature of the businesses. So you want to reconcile all these issues if you are going to grow the economy, which is the basis for taxation, which is the basis for addressing your debt. So we see deeper seated concerns as we began our conversation on how do I even in the first place attract these small savers to invest in the real sector, to invest in the actual production of pineapples, of Irish potatoes. I was shocked the other day. We were all discussing the delay of clearing trucks carrying Irish from Kenya into Uganda. It made social media news that trucks are sitting at Malaba, Busia, and have not been cleared to bring in Irish. The bigger question is, when did Uganda begin importing Irish from Kenya? You are missing the bigger question. It's because possibly the people who were producing Irish potatoes have invested in government bonds. How do I get those fellows back to producing Irish? We are importing carrots, we are importing tomatoes, we are importing onions from the region where we can't tax them. But those are jobs the president raises a concern that if we are importing, then we are creating jobs elsewhere. Now, how do you resolve that? It goes back not to put a tax on Mivumba by kilos. You want to go back and say, is there anybody willing to invest in the textile industry in Uganda when there is a better investment in a government bond? So for me, it's not even a question on how do I make more people buy a government bond, which is creating refinancing and bigger deficits and bigger interests and undermining jobs and production and increasing imports, because we shall continue to eat. But surely, every time I have chips, now I am wondering, who am I supporting? It was a question of wheat, was Russia and Ukraine, but now really Irish, tomatoes and carrots, you don't want to go down that route. So there are deeper-seated policy concerns that we need to be reading the president's letter, not as one speaking to traders, much as he opens his conversation saying, I talk to the traders. The traders are responding to the realities of policy signals that we must revisit and address. So I'm looking forward to continued further engagements, and we'll be communicating to you next month on what is going to be the other topical issue that we want to address in order to continue these conversations on what are the issues. How do you make Uganda competitive in a global setting? What should be the level of our exchange rate? We have seen a threat to our reserves. If the reserves go out, this economy will get into problems. And you don't want to wait for that day. We saw just a feel of that in February. Just Kenya issues a bond and people begin to leave Uganda to go to Kenya. And we felt the music. And it was bad music. But that can become the norm. How do you address all those additional concerns that our reserves must be protected against massive imports of Irish potatoes, of pineapples, and failure to sell from our own areas? So we are going to continue this conversation, and please send in your comments before the link goes off. We shall reach out to all of you who have sent your comments. We are going to read those comments and we will make some written statements, and that will be shared out with the conversations and with you out there, wherever you are. Are there any other? I think I've seen a few comments online, and some of them are really budget. Question is, first of all, strengthen your taxpayers. Make sure no business dies. Do everything possible, even if that will include doing and extending what the president said. Those penalties, don't collect them, defer them. First, the company must exist. It will make us lose some revenue, but I'm not looking at revenue collections for 2023-24. I'm looking at revenue collections on the continuum, in the medium and the long term, and ultimately giving us self-sustainability, less of donations, less of loans, and less of domestic borrowing and external borrowing, and more survival on revenue mobilization. Growing together, or growing Uganda together, is the slogan by the tax authority, and I think everybody needs to look into it, both on the side of those of us who pay the taxes, the side of those who collect and use the taxes. How do we grow Uganda together? I want to thank you very much for being with us in this conversation. I want to thank the media who were able to respond. This, as I've said, was more or less restricted. That's why we called it a press conference, but as you've noticed, we are only relying on the press to get these messages to you. Many of you who are able to log in online, we want to appreciate that. I hope one of these days we are going to see Parliament discuss online. They can still make their views. That will save a lot of money. It will still give us the same purpose of making legislation. How do we become more efficient now that we have invested heavily in the digital space? We are doing it in the academia. We even have exams online. We have lectures online. People are studying abroad online, and they are getting their degrees genuinely. How can we do business better? How can we do extension services online? Thank you very much, and we'll be getting back. Do we have other comments? That taxation compliance goes with how are you using the money. If we don't use the money well, which is the fiscal side, public trust is going to be lost. If we do not account for the money that has come to us, if we also do not engage the taxpayers to understand their businesses, to understand their pains, to say, I hear you, you owe me, but in the interest of the future and growing Uganda together, this is my proposal. Let's not just use the law. This will build trust amidst the different taxpayers. Otherwise, people will continue to disappear. And let's correct the notion that taxpayers are few. We have very many other taxpayers. because I was looking through the report by URA. The bulk of the VAT came from airtime. And I want to believe when you talk about airtime, you're talking about very many Ugandans paying that tax. So let's not only think it is MTN. MTN is a big collector, but the real ultimate pay of that tax are those Ugandans out there, including those within agriculture. The cost of doing business are transferred to the last consumer through the selling price, which is true, and the consumer has a choice, including buying directly from the Chinese. Because remember, the consumer has a limited budget and unlimited wants and needs. So if I can find the Chinese selling that shoe cheaply, don't tell me that's a Chinese. It is a seller who matches my pocket. So those kinds of things, how do we make sure households' incomes go through, and how do we make sure the ultimate payer of the tax is getting value for their money, but we also have concerns about them. The exigencies of COVID from the health perspective, as applied in 2020, should be applied to the COVIDnomics, which is really, we have said, COVID has not left. And as I said earlier, there were banks that were instructed by the central bank to defer certain loan repayments. After 2 years, these were reinstated. Some of them at higher rates, some of these companies haven't recovered. So we want also to go back and say, while we lifted the COVID restrictions and provisions by the central bank, were some of these entities ready? Did they require an extension? What other remedial measures were we supposed to give them? Small-scale industries were given about 200 billion COVID recovery. Yesterday we got information from them that only about 18 billion of that was utilized. What is the problem? Sometimes the problem is arising out of demand side. That even after my business comes back, I still need the consumers also to come back and be able to buy. And most of these consumers have not come back yet. The monitoring and asking consumers to demand receipts for all transactions, it spreads tax all over and beyond. We have actually said sales tax is an option we need to think about, but also there are prices that are fixed. Now, if I buy a newspaper, New Vision, do you expect me to have an EFRIS receipt? Not from anybody, because New Vision fixed that price. We talked about bread. We've talked about toilet paper. Most of these prices are fixed, that the final person selling is only doing us a service of linking the manufacturer with the consumer. I don't know who produces the toilet paper I buy, but the two know each other between the trader. And as we have said, there is no value being added at that last price. So can we know where we should add the value? I buy fuel every day and I pay taxes. But I don't receive a receipt at the petrol station. But I know at that point, government has collected the taxes that was earlier paid by Total and by Shell. Can we learn from the current practices to say who should issue an EFRIS receipt and who should add a tax at that point if there is no value? Surely a petrol station is really a distribution point. The tax has already been paid, and we need to understand these dynamics before we can go around asking EFRIS. And I've seen very many people, we sit at a drinking joint, others are taking water, and when the receipt is finally issued, they want to take a picture of it and send it back to URA to say, is this EFRIS? No, it's not supposed to be EFRIS at commando level. Commando doesn't even issue a receipt, because that tax was paid when the wheat and the cooking oil came in. I think these are conversations we want to continue with, and we are glad that you were out there and you have been part of this conversation. As we've said, write more. They inform us from the Economics Forum. This is real an engagement. And everything we say, you say would not be used against you. It is data collection to inform further research, further conversations, and further engagement. The beauty with research, we delete the source and only go with your complaint and see to what extent is it a genuine complaint to inform policy discussion. So feel free to reach out to us. I think our email needs to be put out there so that people can reach out to us continuously. As I've said, come May, we shall have another topical discussion that we shall invite you to. Thank you very much for those who have been with us.